What's up, guys? If you're not subscribed, please subscribe. Also, please smash that like button on the video and enjoy the show. Well, a guy I'd love to get on the podcast, I haven't worked on it yet, but the guy Reza Pahlavi, who is the son of the Shah, who obviously was kicked out in 79 and then died in exile shortly after that. But he, under that lineage, would be the next in charge, but, you know, not necessarily how it would go if the country was taken over. But he and his family have lived in the United States since then, so he came here, I guess, as a young man.
Yeah, 79, I think.
Yeah, something like that. And, you know, he's talked to a couple people. He's talked to Piers Morgan. I think he did a sit-down with Patrick Bet-David. And he's a very fascinating guy.
Yeah.
And one thing that he seems to have done a good job of since 1979 as he was growing up and becoming his own guy is he is a world visitor and communicator with all kinds of Iranian refugees in different countries and is kind of playing to that cultural identity and, hey, we could go take this back. We could return to our land and get it. Do you think something like that would be a possibility? Because when he's faced with this question, like, hey, would you be open to being back in charge? He's very careful to be like, you know, let's chill with that. I'd like to see a free Iran. Like, he kind of punts it. Like, do you think something like that is possible? And the second part of the question is, and I'm not saying this is a bad thing. I think this is probably a good thing. But that guy's kind of like a U.S. asset. Like, he lives here. I'm sure the intelligence community is very good friends with him. Like, that could totally change Iran to, like, a friend, I would guess, and CIA and those places would be happy if he was in charge.
Yeah. I met him at a dinner party one time, and he's a really interesting guy, like you say. And there is a huge community in the United States of Iranian expats or just descendants of Iranian refugees. There's a lot of them here, and a lot of them would like to see something happen, some change in their country that they could help and support in some way. The one danger, it's always harder for outside groups to influence the course of what's happening politically inside a country. We learned that a bit in Iraq, where there was a big Iraqi exile community, and some of the Iraqi exiles were CIA assets, and they were telling us things like, "Oh, if you go into Iraq, you'll greeted as liberators, and by the way, Saddam has weapons of mass destruction, and we think they're here, here, and here." And I actually met with those people too in the run-up to the Iraq War, and they were pretty convincing. And really, we thought that these guys were going to be able to, they'd come in on our tanks and take over the government, and everybody would love them and welcome them. It turns out it's hard if you've been outside to come and have credibility and tell people, here's what your government should be like. So it would be much better for the Iranians if this happened organically. It's somehow within the country itself, maybe with support and inspiration from Iranians on the outside, but it may be something that has to come from inside the country.
But if it did come from inside the country and then he was called upon, I guess that's possible, right?
Yeah, sure is. I mean, there are some people that will think it's great that he was the son of the Shah. Others will think, no, we hated the Shah. We don't want that again. But I think it'd be an interesting voice in that mix, and maybe somebody with some authority, because he's been kind of a focal point for a lot of the opposition groups and people to rally around. So he has a lot of connections and a lot of things he could bring to the table if given a chance.
How long did you get to talk with him?
So it was a dinner party. It was at an embassy, and it was probably 8 or 9 years ago. And I think he was there with his wife, and he was charming, very smart, had a pretty sophisticated view of what was going on and what was possible and what wasn't. A deep, deep hatred, I can't even tell you, toward the regime, and just the guys that are outside just they view the Ayatollah and his cronies with such vehemence. It's just and you can't blame them, because a lot of them have had their own family members killed or tortured under that regime. And even now, one of the many awful things the Iranians do is target dissidents outside Iran. And so there have been people, a fairly famous case a couple of years ago, where an Iranian from California, he's a U.S. citizen, goes to the Emirates, goes to UAE, Abu Dhabi, or Dubai for a meeting, and gets lured into, we don't know exactly what happens, but he gets essentially whisked out of that country, taken to Oman, and then next thing you know, he ends up in a prison. and he's essentially on death row in Iran. So if you're a dissident, it can get you killed.
There's a woman I'm trying to bring in for a podcast. I've been talking with her team. We'll see if it can happen. But she's here in New York. This woman, Masih Alinejad. I hope I said that right. But she's pretty amazing. She is willing to talk anywhere to anyone, like around the world. I mean, like at different forums, usually events. I haven't really seen her on podcasts, but she's known for having big, beautiful hair because that's like her fuck you to the government.
Yeah.
And she essentially was targeted in the United States by an Iranian hit team that was fortunately thwarted, I believe, by the FBI and caught, and it was stopped. But they were trying to kill her here, like in the United States, which is, I guess maybe it's not that crazy to think about, but these guys are ruthless. They are cutthroat. They want to beat down any opinion that could go against them. I mean, it's a true form of religious fascism, if you will.
Yeah, and they've done it not only against Iranians, but there was a real famous case where there was a plot to kill, I think it was a Saudi diplomat in Washington D.C., and the plot involved bombing a restaurant where he liked to go. So if they had succeeded, they would have potentially killed all those people, including a lot of people just having a nice dinner on a weeknight. And the good thing of the saving grace is that it was so clumsy, and the guys they enlisted to do this job were just idiots, and they just kept kind of like tripping all over themselves. And before they got anywhere close to doing it, the FBI was all over the case, and so they just rolled it up. But it does show you the kind of the audaciousness that they think they can even go into the United States and kill somebody at will, and that's pretty horrible thing to think about. And the other thing to remember about the Iranians is it's not, the government there is not necessarily monolithic. It's controlled by a theocratic leader, the Ayatollah, but there are also factions within the Iranian government. There's groups of hardliners that are more aggressive even than the Ayatollah is, and sometimes
more aggressive than the Ayatollah.
A little less, shall we say, cautious in some of their planning. So that this one group that was this attempt to do this bombing. There were some people in what's called the IRGC, which is the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, who were pushing this plot, and it was never clear at all that on the Ayatollah's level that he knew anything about it. It was just kind of like they were freelancing on this. So there are factions within the government that are even more hardcore than the leadership and could do, are capable of almost anything.
What was the plot?
So this is the one where they're going to bomb a restaurant,
in DC.
Okay. Yep.
All right, got it. So that was them, and he wasn't even aware. Wow, That's interesting. Where did Soleimani fall on that spectrum? So
he was a really dangerous guy, in part because he was a visionary. He was the one
that's
that
nice.
Yeah. So it's someone with brains and also kind of a strategic sense of where he wanted to go, and where he wanted to go was to build this network of proxy groups that would help Iran and would be essentially its foreign arms in the region particularly. But, he wanted it not just to be a bunch of crazy groups with guns, but groups that were integrated within government structures. And it was his vision to turn these, proxy groups in Iraq from being fringe groups to being kind of, the guys that were organized to fight ISIS or however they got started, into being political parties, to being part of the system and being members of the government. And that's what you have now, where they've gone from being sort of outsiders to being insiders in Iraq particularly, and also in Syria to some extent too. And Hezbollah is the same model. They're politically powerful as well as having guns and sometimes some pretty crazy ideas.
And Soleimani was the guy the White House whacked in January 2020.
Yeah,
for context.
And I must say there's no regret, no tears shed by Republicans or Democrats that he was taken out.
Yeah.
It was there was a lot of worry early on that Iran was going to seek retribution in some way. Maybe a big terrorist attack could still happen because Iran has a different timetable than we do.
Sure.
But the fact that he was taken out was taking out a very capable, very smart guy who had high ambitions for what some of these militia groups could do in the region.
Now, who replaced him?
So there's been several others who've kind of risen to the top, none with the charisma and none with the with the vision that Soleimani had. He was kind of a one of a kind. We don't see anyone who's followed him that's been in the same league. He was a uniquely dangerous person.
Are there factions within the government that are, like you mentioned, ones that are even harder line than the Ayatollah? But I assume there's also factions that are maybe to the left of the Ayatollah that perhaps don't like the United States, but could sit there and have a beer with him if they had to. Is that a thing?
Yeah, absolutely. And there've been times in the past where some of those guys have been ascendant and have been helpful to us. After 9/11, there was actually a period where there were meetings between what was then the George W. Bush administration and some Iranians who they don't like Al Qaeda either,
right? Because they're Sunni,
yeah,
right.
And so they were looking at ways that they could be helpful to us. Those efforts were pretty much turned back. We didn't want to get into business with them, but there are pragmatic politicians in Iran that would like to see a more moderate policy, that aren't as convinced that nuclear weapons would be a good way to go for Iran, and to the extent that we can support them and help them. I think that's a good thing. We often see, though, they're often just excluded from politics in the country, because if you're regarded as a moderate or somebody who's potentially willing to deal with the Americans, you're not allowed to run for office. You end up getting kind of pushed back and disqualified for whatever reason. So it's really hard for them to get much of a base.
Thank you for watching the video, guys. If you haven't already subscribed, please smash that subscribe button and check out this clip's full podcast episode by clicking here or in the description below.